Welcome to Stoic Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros,
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
and today we're going to be talking about really applied epistemology, Stoic applied epistemology. So I think of it in terms of strategies or heuristics the Stoics have for thinking well, for forming beliefs that are justified. And thinking about that, I think I suppose the outcome is you want justified beliefs, but what Stoics are always about, like many other ancient philosophers, is character. So the question is, how can you have the epistemic character, the kind of
hmm
character where you're a thoughtful person in the best sense?
Yeah, I think that's the right way to think about it. What I wanted to do with this episode is make epistemology cool again, because we so often we often talk about epistemology as like this. I know when I talk about it with non-philosophers, they're like, "What does that even mean?" And it's like, well, it's something we do all the time, right? It's how we form beliefs. It's how we come to base what we think is true. It's the justification for claiming you have knowledge about something. That's epistemology. And so often when you hear about epistemology in a philosophical context, you think about it in terms of like Descartes' evil demon or the Matrix. How do we even know the world is real? How do I know I even exist? These kind of foundational questions. And those were things that interested ancient philosophers. Those are the kinds of questions that the skeptics and the Stoics argued about. But once you kind of move past those, there's this really interesting applied level of epistemology. As you said, the heuristics and tools for thinking the right kinds of things. And then when you apply that to yourself, how do I become the kind of person that tends to think accurately in situations, that is not often misled, that doesn't jump to conclusions, that isn't easily persuaded by people telling false stories or lies? And that's a really important thing for how we live. It's one of the most important things, much more important, I would say, than um, those foundational questions of if we even exist or something. Once we move past those, the other reason the Stoics really care about epistemology is that virtue is knowledge, as we talk about a lot on this podcast for the Stoics. That idea that it's a virtue ethic and it's about being a certain kind of person, but um, you become a great person by improving your understanding of the world, by improving your understanding of how you should treat other people, what's worth caring about, not caring about, what's worth being angry about or sad about or not. And so, um, this is not a worldview where you can be ignorant but still excellent. You have to be knowledgeable, and so having a really strong heuristic or epistemology practice is crucial for that goal. And so just just a really simple example, if somebody tells you a rumor or a lie and you get angry at somebody and you punish that person, and you'd be right to punish them if they actually did this terrible thing, but they didn't do the terrible thing. And so in that case, your epistemology failing becomes really a moral failing. And that's the connection I want to make is, we're not just talking about um, some sort of abstract application. When we talk about epistemology, we're talking about how we make the decisions to punish people, to get mad, to treat others certain ways. This is like directly tied into our ethical lives. And so that's why I wanted to focus on it. I think it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. It's if you think about the different domains of philosophy for the Stoics, you have the physics, the ethics, and the logic, and it's
Mm-hmm.
that last aspect, logic, that we'll be talking about here. And there are always different cuts or different aspects to logic. Of course, there's sort of the formal practice in terms of specifying valid and sound arguments and such, understanding logical structure, but there's also sort of the practical sort of matter of how do you think well day to day, and that's what we're going to be diving in. That's you put some notes on that very issue for us today.
Yeah. And then the way I'll be structuring this, I'm going to go through 5 lessons from Stoic epistemology and then ground them in, I would say, a day-to-day life. So we're going to go through, and this is something that applies to that brain in a vat situation, to that, am I in the matrix kind of context, but I'm also going to apply it to our day-to-day. So, first lesson from the Stoics, from Stoic epistemology, is what I call to default to skepticism. And so this is something, Caleb, we've talked about in the past, but the Stoics say that we should always default to a skeptical position. And what I mean by that is that we should always withhold judgment until we have a good reason for believing something. So we need to be very careful about what we give our assent to, very careful about what we believe to be true, almost ascribe a kind of defensive position. And the idea is that the first step to knowledge is not to be tricked. The first step to knowledge is not to be ignorant. I think this goes back to this Socratic idea of Socrates would brag that, at least he knows that he knows nothing. That's why he's smarter than other people, where they're ignorant, but they're not aware of their ignorance. And that's something the Stoics carry with them, that default to skepticism all the time. And, we've talked about some exercises to this, like Marcus Aurelius has a line about, you don't have to have an opinion. Epictetus talks about critical assent, which is this idea of always making sure you evaluate your first impressions of things and never accept any of them without testing them. He uses the metaphor of like biting into coins, like make sure none of these coins are counterfeit before you accept them for payment. And so that's that first Stoic idea is we're just, as a Stoic, if you want to be like a Stoic in terms of your epistemology, you need to default to skepticism. You play defensive. You never assent without a good reason to. You never form a belief without a good reason to form a belief.
Yeah, I think that's key. I like how in the Meditations, Marcus Aurelius, that first book, in book 1, he mentioned several people who he admires for, I think, defaulting to skepticism. There's his adopted father. He mentions that he admires his searching questions at meetings, a kind of single mindedness, almost never content with first impressions or breaking off the discussion prematurely. Then he also mentions Sextus, to investigate and analyze with understanding and logic the principles we ought to live by. And I think that's those two actions, investigation, asking searching questions, are sort of two ways skepticism manifests itself. What, and maybe a useful prompt for how one can show skepticism is, of course, not immediately assenting, not immediately agreeing with one's first reaction, but taking that extra step to investigate, ask why, and ask detailed questions of your experience.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So we're not advocating here for kind of like hands over your ears, like nah, I'm not listening, or I don't believe
Right.
you, But like, okay, I hear what you're saying. Why should I believe that? What reason do you have? What reason do you have for thinking that? And will that reason persuade me as well? And that's much more compelling kind of picture than the person who's like, I don't believe anything. Like nobody can pull the wool over my eyes, because that's one thing. And this connects to my next point. But the Stoics differ from the skeptics, which were another ancient school of thought, because they thought we could believe things. They thought we could leave skepticism. You default to skepticism, but then you leave it. Like the same way, if you meet a new person, maybe you default to being kind and open-minded and interested in them, and then you form an opinion, and then you either become their friend or you rightly exclude them from friendship. We can move from this initial position. And so I think that's a great point about we want to start in skepticism, but we want to figure out a way to move out of it. And the way the Stoics, this connects to my second lesson, which was the way the Stoics moved out of skepticism is this thing called a criterion of truth. And this is something that was really popular in ancient philosophy. We don't really talk like this anymore. When I started reading this, I was like, what's a criterion of truth? What are these people talking about? But they all, yeah, the Epicureans, the skeptics, the Stoics, they all argued about this. It was something they all had in common. And basically, the criterion of truth is it's the thing or multiple things, but the thing that justifies believing something to be true. Uh, it's the test that something has to pass or the criteria it must possess before you can rightly believe it. It's the justification. So if something has this or passes this test, then you weren't wrong for believing it. You had a good reason to do so. Um, and the 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 lesson here, I think, is just to think about that idea, because that's not an idea. I'll get to what the Stoics thought the criterion of truth was, but I think that's just an interesting idea, is to have an established standard by which you evaluate things. And so maybe this is not believing anything until a news source reports it. Maybe it's needing a trusted friend to tell you these. Maybe it's something else, but it's the idea about like having this standard that sits outside of the context that you bring into any context. What's really interesting about having a defined standard, or the reason I think it's important, is that it ensures that our deliberation is fair and we don't succumb to confirmation bias. So, a criterion of truth, if properly used, it should force us to believe things we don't want to believe. We don't have any, it should stop us from believing things we want to believe that are false. So, stop us from taking in things that make us feel good. But it should also maybe force us to believe things that make us feel bad, force us to come to reckon with truths that we otherwise are resistant of. Um, and I thought about this kind of test. This is something that I use all the time, but I thought of this test for if you have a good criterion of truth, which is if someone at a bar tells you something and you think it's ridiculous, it goes against your worldview, it would make someone you care about look bad or make yourself look bad. Then the question is, what would make you believe them? What would make you accept this idea? And that's your criterion of truth, or it's at least one of your criteria of truth. Um, and that's, I think, such a powerful idea that we've kind of lost today, is having a really solid standard that we're consistent with. What do you think about the criterion of truth?
Yeah, I think it's an important idea. It raises the question uh, of what you of your example, which is, I think it is useful to think about, if you have a given position, something seems to you to be the case, what evidence would convince you otherwise? How would the world look different if your opinion was mistaken? And I think that exercise can be useful, both if you're thinking about a matter by yourself, but also when you're discussing things with others, trying to get a sense of what is that maybe shared proposition between the two of you, which, if you had an established answer about that idea, it would settle the dispute. So, a simple example of this would just be something, you're debating over the color of some character's eyes or something like this. And then you could solve that dispute by sharing a photo, very easy,
Mm-hmm.
of that person. But then, like, what's the equivalent, I suppose, for so many other questions we're interested in investigating or disputing?
Yeah, and it's a good question, right? Like, it's not. I mean, the Stoics are going to have an answer, but it, it. I think one thing that you raise. I mean, the Stoics are going to talk about this specifically in terms of like sense impressions.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of, I mean, you raised the good example of like, what color is our, maybe not this character, but what color is our friend's eyes? And you go over and look at their eyes and you go, okay, we know they're brown. But it raises this different, is your criterion of truth for fact of history? Is that just Wikipedia? But what about some more politically complicated thing? Or what about some science fact? I think about one thing that I try to do a lot is I try to say, well, what do the experts say? And then I try to revise my beliefs to fit what the experts say, even if I just to try to do that consistently, even if I agree with it. Obviously, there's like some debate about who's an expert and how much pieces of information do you need before you know what the experts say. This idea that I'm not in a rent controlled place would be nice to have rent control. That would be nice. But somebody maybe raises the economic argument that rent control is bad, large scale, and I need to accept that as true if that's kind of the general state of economic thinking, even if it's bad for me personally. That's something that I just try to do a lot. I try to revise my thinking to fit those with expertise. That's not easy, and there's some ambiguity, but it's I think that's important, because otherwise you just end up believing the things that you want to believe and rejecting the things you don't want to believe, and that I don't think that's a good way to live.
Right, right. And I suppose what criteria of truth give you is some rule or rules or principles that are fixed and that you can test the application of over time, I suppose. So that's how they would combat, uh, if they're applied well, they would combat things like confirmation bias and such, because you can notice how you apply a given rule through different cases and apply it consistently.
Yeah, you'd have to apply it consistently. You can't pull out the easy criteria for things you like and the hard criteria for things you don't. It would be consistent application. Yeah, so that's anything else on that idea? Just like having a criterion of truth, having something that you consistently use to judge whether or not you should believe something, and anything else on that?
Well, I think it's important. At the same time, it can be difficult to specify what the criteria are, and that's worth acknowledging. And it's also worth acknowledging that there are sort of different levels of abstraction which you can take the question. Is my criteria of truth for a specific issue, like the color of my friend's eyes? You can think about what would settle that debate in terms of a photo, visual experience, or something of this sort. But you can also get more abstract, more philosophical, of course, with a question. I only accept evidence if it is empirical or something like that, or I only accept evidence if it's produced by a reliable process, and then having some account of what those processes are in the world. So I think we shouldn't understate how difficult it is to come up with a proper criterion, and then apply it across many different domains.
Yeah, I think it's like a craft like anything else that you develop in time. It's just something that most people aren't practicing, because I don't think this is necessarily how we talk about it anymore. Or if they are practicing it, they're not using this ancient language, which is
Sure,
fine.
sure.
Okay, don't expect them to. Why can't we talk about it the way the Stoics do? But you've got to start. And I think anybody is or everybody's already doing this in some way. So it's first to understand how you're doing it inconsistently, and which of those you want to keep and make consistent, and which of those you will admit, I'm kind of keeping a low standard. If someone gives me a compliment, are you as critical and examining of them as if they give you an insult? And probably not, right? You're probably much quicker to accept the compliment than the insult. And so that's an example of how we switch between our criteria pretty consistently. Next, moving to lesson 3. So start with skepticism. We get out of skepticism by having a criterion of truth. And now, how do we actually pick that criterion of truth? Well, I think the Stoic lesson here is to be actually pretty common sense. And it's a kind of a rejection of the skeptic opinion, which is that we never really can get one. That's the main skeptic argument, is nothing's ever good enough. If your friend walks in and you see their brown eyes, how can you even trust your sense impression? How do you even know they exist? How do you even know you exist? That's the skeptic line. And the Stoics are going to kind of scoff at this and be like, that's a bit ridiculous. We need to just be common sense about it. And the way they're going to get around it, specifically with sense impressions, and I want to abstract this out because we don't really worry too much about sense impressions nowadays. But the way they get around it with sense impressions is their criterion of truth is what's called a cognitive impression. And it's like cataleptic impression in Greek. Um, and that's an impression that accurately represents its object in a way that a fake object could not. So it's something that has such a degree of clarity and specificity that you couldn't be mistaken. And so an example of that is if you're driving and you see a cow a few miles up the road, that's not a cognitive impression. That could be a colored boulder, that could be a sign, that could be. I think about this when I drive in Canada. Sometimes people have these like fake deer in their lawn.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't know if you have that where you live, Caleb. And I'll be driving at night and my lights will hit and I'll go, and I'll get all scared that this deer is on the side of the road and going to run out. And then I go, oh, okay, it's just a fake deer. That's good. I wish you didn't put that there. That's an example of not a cataleptic impression. It's something you're not sure what it is. Is it a deer? Is it not a deer? But then, if I pulled over, I got out, I using the cow example, I saw the cow. It was a real cow. I petted the cow, smelt the cow, looked the cow in the eyes. The Stoics would say that's a cataleptic impression. That's a cognitive impression of a cow. Let's not overcomplicate things. You're clearly seeing one. When I get out and I touch the fake deer or stand by the fake deer and I see that it's made of wood, it's not a deer. I can be pretty confident of that. And I don't want to make this about whether or not the Stoics defeat skepticism. We've talked about these kinds of things before. But the point here, I think the Stoic point is that, look, your criteria should follow common sense. It doesn't have to be some impossible bar to clear. Knowledge doesn't, or at least catalepsis doesn't have to be this kind of hidden thing. When we're petting a cow, or you're looking at your friend's eyes, or your photo of a friend on Facebook, you're seeing the color of their eyes. You don't have to ask if you're a brain in a jar, or if you're plugged into some simulation, if you're part of the matrix. You just know that that's true. That might not be satisfying to some people, but I think there is a lesson here about, look, if this heuristic is going to work, it has to be something that things can reasonably clear. It has to be a bar that is both high enough to instill confidence, that you can act on your knowledge with confidence or your belief with confidence, but low enough that you can actually incorporate enough things to go about interacting with the world coherently. And so finding a criterion that is just, it's common sense, it's around the middle, maybe it's upper middle, but it's not
Mm-hmm.
impossible, and it's not on the ground. That's the third Stoic insight from their epistemology.
I suppose this brings out the question, how do you determine what's common sense? Do you have any thoughts on that, or how the Stoics went about that question?
Yeah, I mean, so the Stoic line on sense impressions is kind of unsatisfying, right? The Stoic line on sense impressions is that God has constructed us in a way to not be deceived. So God has given us the mental capacity to correctly differentiate between a cow and a fake cow, basically saying that like a kind of matrix-like imitation cow would be impossible. God wouldn't construct a universe where that's possible, and humans just have a capacity that if we sit and think about something carefully enough, we can tell the difference. They also thought that, here's another interesting idea. They also thought that cataleptic impressions had a kind of motivational force. So
Mm-hmm.
you actually had to kind of fight not to believe them because they're so obviously true. Epictetus raises this funny example where he says, you're a skeptic, but if I threw this pan at your head, you duck, right? And his point would be like, you're receiving a cataleptic impression of something coming towards your face and you want to get out of the way. So there is also this idea of not fighting something that has a motivational force, but that really comes down to this idea that we can trust our instincts, trust our nature, in a way that, I mean, maybe is counterintuitive to the skepticism, but I guess the opinion is that the Stoic view is that our nature, if we are mindful and intentional, has the ability to tell the difference between what's true and false. But
Mm-hmm.
if we're sloppy, unintentional, not mindful, then we'll get it wrong. But if we plug in, we have the skills to tell the difference, or the skills to know when we don't have enough information. So that's kind of that's why I've always found it a bit unsatisfying. But what do you think?
Well, I suppose I was wondering what's the Stoic account of common sense? And by that I mean, how do you know whether a given tactic or something like that is common sense. So if you're thinking about the rent control type problem, how do you apply common sense to that discussion?
Hmm.
Or how do you apply common sense to thinking through a career decision or something of that sort? I think, maybe we have an idea that common sense, well, I think that includes maybe some amount of knowledge that's passed through tradition or generations to some extent. It involves some of what you said just now in terms of like paying attention to what's in front of you, not obscuring your vision or coming up with theories of what's happening that have nothing to do with reality. It has the sense of being concrete and such. Um, but I guess what exactly is common sense, I suppose, was the question. There are a few different ingredients to it.
Yeah, I mean, I introduced that term, so maybe I'm muddling the conversation a bit. I meant it more as a contrast to the kind of skeptic extreme position,
Gotcha.
but like that phrase common sense aside, I think the idea here would be, well, we could just sit down and write on a piece of paper pretty quickly. Okay, so the rent control example, well, we should probably trust expertise. We should probably not trust things that just happen to us, because things that just happen to us are not generalizable to a large scale. We should look at different sources of information. We should consider people that disagree before coming to a conclusion. I think these kinds of, it would be a rule like this, pretty kind of reasonable positions. It's not something like only one person can tell you, or only you can tell yourself, or any sort of extreme in either direction. We just gotta we you construct a um I think a reasonable heuristic, and then the skill is in applying it consistently.
It's certainly a tricky question. Um, and yeah, so I suppose the thought is the lesson three is as a contrast. We're thinking about the criteria of truth. Some people just have extremely high criteria where
Yeah.
nothing can pass the bar. And what the Stoics reject that approach. And this was the upshot of lesson three is that, we should reject it as well, which means we can come to form beliefs. And then, how we specify what common sense is, or which impressions we should trust or not. The Stoics give us some ingredients for that question, of course, and then I think it's just a matter of applying advice from other philosophers, other fields, a mix of general advice, domain specific type question, just really getting your hands dirty, I suppose, with whatever question you're concerned with.
Yeah, like Epictetus has all these lines where he just like kind of throws up his hands and is disgusted by talking to these skeptics or something, and being like, how can I even talk to you? Like, you're telling me you can't tell if it's daytime and the sun is out. Like, how can I can't even have a conversation with you. You're not like, we're not speaking the same language. You're not trying to pursue truth. And so that is to say that I guess the upside here is don't lock yourself out from truth in an attempt to pursue it. Don't be like, oh, it's so important I get this right. I'm going to construct such an unachievable criteria for myself that I'm actually not going to give myself access to the kinds of true beliefs that are right in front of me, because I'm going to make it such a high bar to clear. And that's really what the Stoics are rejecting. I think you gave good examples. I tried to give some examples of what that common sense might look like. It's obviously context specific, but um, as you said, reject that I guess, temptation to hold yourself to such a high standard that you can't even really navigate the world coherently.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. Cool.
Cool. And so, so that's on the criterion of truth. And then lesson 4 is going to be this idea that the Stoics have around impressions. I call it building confidence through expertise. But one of the things the Stoics think, so I think is true, they think that people receive different impressions from the same event. Well, that part is obviously true. But that the impression you receive from an event is actually modified by your experience. And one way this comes about is that experts receive very different impressions than non-experts. So I literally do not hear the same thing. My mind does not experience the same thing when I listen to Mozart as a symphony pianist. They experience something different than I do. They don't just interpret the thing. That's I guess that's the jump, is they don't just interpret the thing differently. They actually experience something differently because it's already being filtered through our minds, and their mind is taking in that information differently, constructing a different representation of it. I was thinking a lot about cows when I was writing this when I was writing this outline. So when I see a cow, I just see a cow. I think that's a cow. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's not even a cow. Maybe it's a bull. But when a farmer sees a cow, or are bulls cows? Do you
Yeah.
know?
Actually, bulls are male, cows are female. Both are cattle, though.
Oh, well, there you go. See, that reveals my ignorance. But when a farmer sees a cow, they might know their age, the cow's health, the type of cow, whether it's a bull or not, like I just did. So they see something different. So these were called, for the Stoics, were called expert impressions. I'm an expert in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'm comfortable saying that. So like when I watch a movie, I immediately am like, oh, that fight scene is silly, or that's a really good fight scene. I intuit that almost immediately just from hours of watching people fight. Um, and so one of the Stoic points here is that expert impressions are a great criterion of truth. In other words, we can learn to trust things with more confidence when we know a lot about this thing. And that's a reason to gain expertise. It's a reason to value expertise and gain expertise, because yeah, it helps us. I guess it's both to say, become an expert in something and trust your expertise in that. And then if you find other bona fide experts, not people that just say that they are, but bona fide experts, then trust their experience, listen to their experience, because that's basically a good way of coming about knowledge, or an effective way to come about knowledge.
Yeah, and I think this gets at some answer to some of the earlier questions we had around, how do you define the criteria of truth? What does common sense look like? Um, One way to answer those questions is to determine, what does it mean to become an expert in this domain? And what do other experts use as their criterion of truth? And what do I need to become an expert in my thinking? So I think that's pretty a useful way to make progress on those kinds of questions.
Yeah, I really like that. What do other experts? How does an expert decide what to believe?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's probably a pretty good uh, standard for yourself. Great one. And that's something that I think about, which is this idea of, we don't want to. I guess the point is just to yeah, to privilege expertise, to value expertise, um, and another reason to cultivate that in ourselves. Um, One thing that I always thought in my own life, getting a bit away from epistemology here, one thing my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu coach used to say is, like, if you get really good at Jiu-Jitsu, you can like know what it is to be good at something, and then you can apply that to the other crafts in your life. You can feel expertise, and that's something that I think that they're applying here to knowledge, right? Once you really know something, you understand the standard it takes to reach that. I think about that in terms of my own philosophy education, in terms of my PhD. I think what my PhD gave me more than anything was actually a kind of humility about, wow, if I know something about Stoicism, then I don't know anything about anything else. Like I don't reach that standard anywhere else. And so it gives you almost a kind of humility. Just an interesting thing to think about, and a good way to generate that criteria for yourself.
I think so. I think that's right. And I suppose there's that another line on this is that, Marcus Aurelius praises Sextus for his ability to analyze, understand issues in detail, and one way to think about advancing in expertise is something like the amount of detail you have mastery over. Of course, that's just one aspect. There are many different aspects. But I think that connects nicely with the point that experts see the world differently than non-experts, or even intermediates, beginners and such. And you can recognize that kind of progression in yourself,
Mhm.
whether it's playing chess, understanding social interactions, whatever it is.
Yeah, great. And so moving on to the fifth lesson. And so we're at this point now, right? Uh, default to skepticism, have a defined criterion of truth to get out of skepticism. That criterion of truth shouldn't be at such a high standard that it's unachievable. And that when we're looking for it, expertise is a good way to start, either what you're an expert in or what other people have expertise, what other experts use to navigate these kinds of situations. I think the last way to go about, because we're really, as a Stoic, we're trying to be out in the world. We're not trying to be perfect. We're trying to, at least as a progressing Stoic, we're not trying to be perfect. We're trying to integrate in the world in good faith and have these good heuristics. So one of these other heuristics that the Stoic raise is to have opinions that are revisable. So the question is, we've raised this criteria of truth. We've given cognitive impressions as an example. We've given expertise as another example. But how do we navigate a world where we can't always have cognitive impressions of everything, where not everything passes the criterion of truth we've set for ourselves? Well, the Stoic answer is we have these kind of, I can call them weak beliefs, but that has a technical background in Stoicism. So it's more just beliefs that are revisable, or beliefs that have a recognition of their weakness kind of built into them. So we form opinions about things that are ready to be revised upon new evidence. It's hard to do, but it's something like saying, well, the evidence points mostly in this direction, so that's how I'll act until new evidence comes. That is a much different thing than saying this is the best course of action. To say this seems like the best course of action, but I'm open to new evidence. And the Stoic point is unless you're confident, unless it passes that criteria, form opinions like this, form your beliefs like this. There's this really funny story from a funny ancient story. So this is an ancient example, which can either be a criticism of Stoicism. You can either think it's really smart, or you think it's really stupid, depending on where you're coming from. It's either interested in what people listening think about. You think the Stoic had a good answer, or do you think it's a cop out? But basically, there's a Stoic, and a skeptic tries to trick them. So the skeptic gives them a wax piece of fruit to eat, and the Stoic bites into it. And the skeptic is like, I tricked you. You believe that was a fruit. You thought you had a cognitive impression of a fruit, but cognitive impressions, they don't work. So you were wrong. Cognitive impressions aren't good criterion of truth. And the Stoic is like, no. I only opined that it was likely to be a fruit. I only formed the belief that it seemed to be the case to be a fruit. And whether or not that's satisfying, it can be both at the same time. But I think there is a lesson here to be like that Stoic, and to go, if you go about and think, you start dating someone new and you don't think, wow, this is the person for me. This is the love of my life. We'll always be together. But instead you think, wow, this seems like this could be the person. This seems like this could be the person I spend my life with. How much less heartbroken will you be if it goes south? Or if you start a new job and you're excited for it, and you think, well, this could be a really good opportunity. Just framing things around that, framing things as these beliefs that are open to revision, and not committed beliefs. It's a better way to live in terms of the truth. But as we said at the start, the goal is to live a good life, right? The truth is intermingled with the ethical aspect of life and the happiness aspect of life. So not only will you be closer to the truth, but you will be happier if your beliefs are open to revision. You will be more ethical if your beliefs are open to revision, right? If you judge somebody, you hate someone, and you say, well, I'm going to hate them until I get new evidence. And then you get evidence that they've changed or they've genuinely apologized. Well, now you're a kinder person. You're a more forgiving person. So that, I think, that's one of those important heuristics where it's like, I'm both going to hold myself to this high standard and pursue truth, but I'm also going to understand that I can't have truth everywhere. So I'm going to develop this way of acting with as much confidence as I can act, but being open to changing my mind later. Something that I'm trying to balance in my own life.
Yeah, this lesson's awesome. And I think it brings together the strands of the previous ones. You were saying before we started recording that it's an application of the reserve clause, the Stoic reserve clause to epistemology, which I think is a really nice way to think about it. In action, you have the idea that when I'm coming up with plans or something of this sort, so I can advise us to think, I'll do this, fate willing. This will happen, fate willing, and such. And that way, you have this recognition that you'll do your best, but while recognizing that things might turn out differently. The external world is not something we have direct control over. And likewise, I think you can think about many beliefs we come to form as having a similar character, in the sense that, I think this is the case, reality willing, and then being open to the possibility that evidence comes out differently. And if it does come out differently, if you get new information, then you can change your belief. So I think that's a nice analogy, and a nice way the reserve clause works throughout different areas of life.
Yeah, absolutely. Like so much of Stoicism is just, it's about having a smooth flow of life. Something I come back to is that phrase from Epictetus, a smooth flow of life. And there's two ways to have a smooth flow of life. And that's, one is to not overcommit to things that are false, because things get bumpy when you pull in one direction, and fate, life, the world pulls you in another. It's a very jarring experience. The other way to have a smooth life is to double down on the things that are true. Ride the waves when you know they're true. And I think this encapsulates kind of both of those, which is to say, having a criterion of truth, pursuing knowledge, that's about committing to, I'm going to actually really follow the flow of things when I know it's the flow of things, when I know it's the way the world is. I'm not going to put myself against the flow of the world. And then the defaulting to skepticism and having revisable opinions, that's about limiting the downside of ignorance, which is to say, I'm not going to tie myself to the wrong cart here. I'm not going to form any opinions that are in opposition to how things are, because I know those are painful. I know those don't end up well. It's kind of if you live like this, your life will be a lot smoother without really sacrificing much of the commitment and enthusiasm and joy,
Yeah, I think so. I think my takeaways from these lessons are just another reminder to carefully respond to impressions instead of immediately reacting with assent or disagreement. I think that's always a good reminder. And then I do really like this application of the reserve clause to our beliefs, and then thinking through, okay, what is the evidence that would cause me to change my mind, and actively trying to seek out that evidence when doing so is beneficial.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. I think I take away similar things. I try to really, the criterion of truth is really hard if you apply it to things that don't make you feel good or hard decisions. It's really hard, but it's something I try to trust it. And you should revise your criterion if it's not, if it's producing incorrect incorrect results, but you shouldn't revise if it makes you feel bad, because then it's the world that's making you feel bad, or it's the world that's doing the thing you don't prefer. It's not your decision-making process. You should trust that decision-making process. And that, for me, I think your reminders were, your takeaways were very true. I think my takeaway is just is primarily a reminder of the power, or I wouldn't say the power, the challenge of doing that, the actual craft of doing that on a day-to-day, when it's very tempting to make an excuse this time.
That's true. That's also true. Yeah, that's always a temptation.
Cool.
Awesome. Did you want to add anything else?
No, maybe I'll go through those one more time.
Cool.
So from the top, these are 5 lessons and grounded in Stoic epistemology, but made a bit more applicable for the day-to-day. First is to default to skepticism. So take a defensive posture, be cautious about what comes along. It's always harder to unlearn ignorance or remove a belief after you've formed it. The second is to have a defined criteria of truth. So have some sort of standard you hold yourself to and then apply it consistently and fairly in that situation. That's how you'll avoid confirmation bias. That's how you'll gain confidence in the things you do believe. When developing a criteria of truth, the third idea is to have common sense, and I don't mean common sense as a rejection of expertise. We'll get to that. We get to that in the next part. But common sense is to say, don't have it to be some standard so high it's not achievable. We want to believe things. We want to go about committing to things, as long as you have a good reason to do so. Then the fourth lesson is that we can build confidence around our criteria of truth through expertise. So, think about how you think about the things you know a lot about, and then maybe expand that to other domains. Or when you're entering a new environment, maybe that's politics, economics, like the examples we used. Trust what the experts think, or not trust what the experts think. I shouldn't say that. That's incorrect. Reflect on how the experts come to a decision, and then apply that process. And then the last one is that, well, look, we can't always be experts. We can't always meet our criterion of truth. So what do? Well, we form opinions that are revisable. We have beliefs that we recognize might be false, but we're going to act on until more evidence comes around. And that's a way to have a belief system that is open to new information, open to moving closer to the truth, but still allows us to take a position, still allows us to commit in our roles and in our life. And so that's some common sense Stoic epistemology.
Awesome. Sweet. Well summarized.
Cool. Thanks, Caleb.
Thanks, Michael.